Good morning, everyone. This morning, we have an opportunity to be part of a conversation with two leading faith-based social activists and educators who will speak with us and talk with us about their efforts to build understanding and collaboration across religious lines. Our moderator, Dr. Henry Goldschmidt, will introduce them in a moment. But before he does that, I'd like to introduce you to him. He's the director of the Interfaith Center of New York, the director of education programs, and has brought this program to us today. The Interfaith Center works to build relationships of mutual understanding and respect among New York religious and civic leaders. Dr. Henry Goldschmidt is also a cultural anthropologist and scholar of New York's religious diversity. One of his many jobs is introducing New Yorkers and others to religious diversity by introducing them to their diverse neighbors, and that is what he will do with us and for us this morning. Please welcome Dr. Goldschmidt.
Thank you guys, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm too tall for this mic, but I think it'll work out. Well, thank you, Mary. I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm thrilled that you've invited us to share some time with the Regis community today. So as Mary said, my name is Henry Goldschmidt. I'm the Director of Education Programs at the Interfaith Center in New York. And one of the things, I think the most important thing that I do in my work at the Interfaith Center is to help create programs like this that break down the barriers between New York City schools and the diverse religious communities that are all around them. For example, by inviting wonderful activists and educators like Tom and Mehnaz, Tom Dobbins and Mehnaz Afridi, who I'll introduce more in a moment, to come spend some time with you all on a kind of soggy spring morning. So the reason that the Interfaith Center does this kind of program, the reason we think that it is so important, as Mary said, to teach people about religious diversity by actually introducing them to their religiously diverse neighbors, rather than just reading about it in a textbook. The reason we think that this kind of program is so important, and the reason we hope that it's worth an hour of your morning today, it has everything to do actually with the distinction between religious diversity and pluralism that Diana Eck raised in the short essay that most of you, I think, have read in advance of this conversation. Trust me, there's not going to be a pop quiz. But I hope you've had a chance to look at this brief piece by Diana Eck that the faculty at Regis has distributed, and if not, you can get it and take a look later. But so in this essay, From Diversity to Pluralism, Diana Eck, she argues, she says, pluralism is the engagement that creates a common society from the foundation of religious or racial or ethnic diversity. So pluralism, it requires something more than just the sheer fact of having religiously diverse people in the same neighborhood, in the same city, in the same community. It requires relationships, it requires engagement. So for example, she says, on the same street in Silver Spring, Maryland, and you could say the same of a lot of streets throughout New York. In the same street in Silver Spring, Maryland, are a Vietnamese Catholic church, a Cambodian Buddhist temple, a Ukrainian Orthodox church, a Muslim community center, a Hispanic First Church of God, and a Hindu temple. This is certainly diversity, but without any engagement or relationship among the diverse groups, it may not be an instance of pluralism. And I think you can say the same thing, the same distinction between diversity and pluralism applies just as well to the ways that we learn about the religious worlds that are all around us. right? You can read, a world religions or global studies textbook that has a chapter, about that Vietnamese Catholic Church and the Cambodian Buddhist temple and the Muslim Community Center and the Hindu temple. You can go like chapter by chapter in your textbook and learn about each of those traditions. And you're learning there about religious diversity. But if you don't have some real understanding of the relationships among these traditions and communities in the world around you, then you're not really being prepared to participate in a pluralistic society, which is, for better or worse, and I think better, what we've got here in New York and in the United States. So a real education for pluralism requires more than that kind of, textbook world religions survey. And education for pluralism, I think, requires two key things, and we're going to try to do a little bit of both of those today. First, it requires learning about the relationships among religious communities in the world around you. How are people of faith from different backgrounds, traditions, communities, perspectives, working together to create a better society. And this is what Tom Dobbins and Mehnaz Afridi will introduce us to today by talking a little bit from their own perspectives about interfaith relations and coalitions in New York City. And then second, I think the most important thing for a real education for pluralism is an invitation to you all as students to participate in the pluralism that you are learning about, to become a part of the conversation. And that's what we'll do in the second half of our time together this morning. We'll hear briefly from Tom and Mehnaz, but we really want to save a lot of time today for questions from you all, conversations amongst us all together, to really draw you in to the pluralism of American society and of New York's religious communities. So those are our goals today. We don't have a huge amount of time to accomplish them, but we'll do our best. Our speakers, I'm not going to read long bios of them. I think most of you have received a flyer with bios of our speakers. If you haven't got this, I believe there's more copies here, and maybe on the way out you can get a copy and learn a little bit more about them. But I'll just say very briefly, Dr. Mehnaz Afridi is an assistant professor of religious studies and director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. And Tom Dobbins, Jr. is the Justice and Peace Coordinator in the Department of Social and Community Development of Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New York. And I'm really just delighted that they could both join us today. And I will pass this on to them in no particular order. They're working out the order.
Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you all for being here this morning. It turns out we flipped the coin, you just didn't see us, and it turns out that I'm going to go first. But as Henry said, my name is Tom Dobbins. I'm Justice Peace Coordinator at Catholic Charities here in the Archdiocese of New York. And in that job, it's kind of a strange title. So one time I was at a conference, I remember someone was coming out to the elevator, they saw my name tag, and then someone, it was a husband and wife, one pointed to the other and said, "He's in charge of justice and peace in the world." And so the wife looked over at the husband and said, "Tell him he needs to do a better job." So what I'm in the process of doing here is hopefully trying to do a better job bringing communities together. But the way I'd like to start out our conversation today really is more why interfaith cooperation and interfaith work is important. And the way I'm going to start out by saying that is something that I think can give context to it all. On a personal level, it's important to me because I think all of us, I myself live in the New York metropolitan area, obviously we all do. Diversity is an everyday experience that we have. When we wind up going out of our school here and we wind up going home to our families, we encounter diversity all over the community, the society. Everywhere we go, there's diversity. And for myself too, there's a tremendous diversity in the number of people who are blessed to be in my pool of friends. I have many wonderful friends from all over the world, and one particular area I have many very good friends from is from the Middle East. I have friends from the Middle East who have come to live here for a time. Some have remained, some have gone back home. I have friends from the Middle East who are both Muslim and Christian. So from that perspective, I think that interfaith relationships and interfaith cooperation, I think, is very, very important. Another reason I think it's extremely important, and one of the reasons I wanted to try in a professional way to kind of develop and work in this area, is because the events in the first 10 years, I think, of this century, the terrible tragic events of, for example, we just opened up the museum downtown, commemorating the tragic events of September 11th, 2001. We also have its aftermath in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In a real way, those first 10 years tore our world apart in many, many real ways, and still sort of do. Tore apart myself. I lost people. Actually, I used to work in the World Trade Center. I lost people myself in the World Trade Center. It tore our city apart, and indeed it tore our whole world apart. And I think as Catholic Christians, we are called to be part of the engagement, part of that bringing together of communities, and part of trying to move that rift together. And the third thing I think Henry mentioned a little bit when he mentioned Diana Eck. The third thing I want to talk about is that as Catholic Christians, I think it's very important that we be part of this conversation across interfaith boundaries, because I know the word that Henry talked about when he talked about moving from diversity to pluralism is the word engagement. And I think as Catholic Christians, this is very important because we believe, first and foremost, in the example of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, I think for us, obviously has to be the lodestar, the person towards whom we are trying to move our lives. And in a very real way, when you wind up talking about Jesus, Jesus is not an idea, he's not a philosophy, he's not a doctrine, he's not a book. We believe that Jesus became man. Jesus actually came, God came down to earth and became man, and he became a person. And the way that God chose to engage with us is he chose to engage with us through conversation. He chose to engage with us through parables. He chose to engage with us actually person to person, to be able to wind up encountering other people and to bring those diverse persons together and to engage them, and in a sense to create a pluralism of goodness, a pluralism of charity, a pluralism of mercy. Another thing, I'm very happy to be in a Jesuit school and speaking when we have actually our first Jesuit Pope. I'm a big fan of Pope Francis's, and I think you ought to be too. And I think he's a very good example, I think, of what interfaith cooperation should look like on a macro level. Some of you may be aware, but one of the very first actions he did last Easter is he actually went about going on Holy Thursday, and as you may be aware, one of the things the priest does on Holy Thursday is washes the feet of people to imitate what Jesus did at the Last Supper. Oftentimes, according to canon law, this should really only be done, for example, to other men. But Pope Francis, by example, and I think he's kind of giving a message to us, reached out and not only washed the feet of women, but also washed the feet of women who were both Christian and Muslim. And he did so not just the very first year he was Pope, but he did so again this year when he went to an elderly home. First year he went out to a prison, second year he went to a home for the elderly. And again, he chose to wash the feet of women, he chose to wash the feet of Muslims. So I think from that perspective, he certainly is, I think, giving us a message of the importance of interfaith cooperation. I think it's something we should listen to as well. And even in his words, Pope Francis, in his most recent apostolic exhortation, which is called The Joy of the Gospel, said a couple of things, and I just want to read two of them briefly to you. The first, he says, we should embrace with affection and respect Muslim immigrants who wind up coming to our countries. The reason he mentioned this is because in Europe there's been a lot of anti-Muslim feeling that has been growing, and he wanted to wind up addressing these things in the apostolic exhortation that he had. He also said that we must be careful to avoid hateful generalizations about Muslims, noting that in authentic Islam, and proper readings of the Quran are opposed to violence. He also noticed that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And he wanted to also bring out to many Catholics, which they may not be aware of, that in the Quran mentions Jesus, mentions Mary, mentions Abraham. Many of the same figures that are mentioned in our own Bible are mentioned in the Quran as well. Another thing that I would like to do, if I could, is just also mention that Pope Francis has a tremendous background when he winds up reaching back into Catholic teaching, because we have a wonderful example of interfaith cooperation with Pope Francis's namesake, Saint Francis, who back in 1292, during the height of the Crusades, actually crossed enemy lines to go meet the Sultan of Egypt at that particular time and try to wind up engaging with him and wind up talking with him, and encountered that really left both men changed forever. In a professional sense, one of the things I would just like to bring up, and very, very briefly, is from 2009 to 2011, Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New York undertook a program where we would bring together Islamic communities in the Bronx, Manhattan, and in Staten Island to work together with other communities that are working in cooperation with Catholic Charities in those same boroughs, and would work together on social service projects, such as food pantry operations, advocacy on food issues, youth food and cleanup drives, immigration support services, and joint participation in prayer services such as Martin Luther King prayer services, where those individuals would wind up coming together to encounter one another, as we had talked about beforehand, and to encounter each other as persons, working towards the same goal, working on the same goal that is important in both the Bible and in the Quran: feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting those who are in prison, doing all those other wonderful things that we are implored to do by both Jesus and by the writings of the Quran. And in this experience, we had many wonderful opportunities to wind up interacting with people. During the question and answer period, I would love to go into more detail about those, but I just want to give you a little bit of a background about where I'm coming from as far as this goes, because as Justice and Peace Coordinator, one of the most important roles I see is to try to wind up helping to foster peace in the communities and the parishes of the Archdiocese of New York. And I think the encounter between those who are from the Islamic community and from the Catholic community is one of the most important of those areas. So thank you, and I look forward to the question and answers.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Very loud, right? Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
And you would respond, wa alaikum assalam. May peace be upon you. And thank you, Mary, for having me here. And thank you, Henry, for organizing this. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to tell you a couple of things about myself and Islam, and how Islam is pluralistic, and how Islam is deeply connected and rooted with the Christian faith. I am a faculty member at a Catholic college, Manhattan College. I teach Islam, world religions, religion and the Holocaust, religion and genocide. I'm also, as a Muslim woman, the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. So my story, via my position, tells it all. A Muslim woman heading a Holocaust center at a Catholic school. So if you look at my work, or if you look at the very action that Tom was talking about in terms of Jesus and God, the very act of being for me is about pluralism. The air I breathe, the places I have been about pluralism. As a Muslim woman, I have never, ever felt homogeneous. I've always felt other with others and diverse with others. So that's the first thing about me that I want to share. The second thing I want to share is, how do you get involved with pluralism? It's not just an intellectual activity, but what can you do as students? What can you do in your future? In Parkchester, Bronx, there is a mosque which is inside of a parking lot. It is called Al-Iman Mosque. The sheikh, or as we refer to the imam, is from Zambia. He's married to a wonderful woman, Sharina, who is from Guyana. They're both Muslim. They used to work on Wall Street, and they decided several years ago when they had 3 children that they wanted to open up an Islamic school. So they left their high-powered jobs and decided to do that in Parkchester, Bronx. 3 years ago, there was a Chabad community, which is a Jewish Orthodox community in the Bronx, that needed a space because they could not pay for their rent for their synagogue and their services. So the Muslim couple, the imam, said to the rabbi, why don't you just take a room inside of my mosque? And they did. So there is a synagogue inside of the mosque in Parkchester. Not only that, but my students like you, go there twice a year and refurbish the place with the other Jews and Muslims. So what's going on here? What we're doing here is working on building a project that in itself has a very beautiful aura of not just being interfaith, but pluralistic. There are kids there that are your age, some older, some even younger. And it becomes an intergenerational pluralistic project. That's a concrete example of what we can do for one another. And as a Muslim, the Quran states, very much similar to the Christian faith, all the charitable acts. And I'm going to read you a passage. These are the most important things in terms of what a Muslim is required to do. To believe in Allah, which is just a name for God in Arabic, and the last day, and the angels, and the book, and the messengers, to spend your substance out of love for Him, for your kin, for orphans, for the needy, for the wayfarer, for those who ask, and for the ransom of slaves, to be steadfast in prayer, and practice regular charity, to fulfill the contracts which ye have made, and to be firm and patient, in pain or suffering and adversity. And throughout all periods of panic, such are the people of truth, the Allah-fearing. All of these commandments that Muslims believe in come from Judaism and Christianity. In the Quran, it says that God gave messages before Prophet Muhammad came with the message of the Quran. In order to be a Muslim, you must recognize Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and the last Prophet Muhammad. There is no Islam without Judaism and Christianity. It cannot exist by itself. There is a lineage that Muslims believe in. And there shall not, as the Quran says, coercion in religion. The Quran states, I'm going to give you a little more of this, let there be no compulsion in religion, thereby suggesting that acceptance of the Quran's revelations about divinity is a matter of individual choice. Another verse directs Muhammad to say to his detractors, to you be your way and me mine, suggesting that just as others have freedom to follow his. A third example indicates that it is within the purview of divine wisdom that many communities and nations exist. All of this talk about diversity is created by God. This is our challenge. This is our path that God has given us. And it says in the Quran, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes, that ye may know each other, cooperate, engage with one another, suggesting that a diversity of nations and by implication, a diversity of belief systems is part of the divine organization of humanity. The Quran states that the messengers, like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, came as emissaries of the same God. You know, in growing up as a Muslim and in my tradition, although I attended Catholic school for 2 years in London, and my mother went to Catholic school because we had missionaries where I'm from, originally in Pakistan. So that, you know, Christianity is not at all alien or other or foreign to us. But one of the things I was always taught as a young child was to really love Jesus, who we refer to as Isa. Jesus is the most beloved prophet and messenger of God. And the crucifixion story in Islam is different from the Christian, where, yes, in both the stories, Jesus is put on the cross, but God loved him so much that he would never let him suffer on the cross, and he's taken away. So that story is told over and over again. Jesus had more miracles. Moses had more miracles than Muhammad. Right? And Jesus was about love, alleviating suffering. All of these messages are in Quran. It's up to us to understand our faith. And when you understand someone else's faith, and my journey with Judaism is very powerful, when I studied Judaism, I became more aware of my own spiritual Islamic faith. Thank you.
We're going to open this up to questions from all of you in just a moment, but there's one question I would like to kind of pose to both of you to get started, and it actually jumps right off of Mehnaz's closing observation that you said when you studied Judaism, in many ways it helped to deepen your own faith and your own Islam. So I wondered, I mean, I don't want to put you guys on the spot to speak to personally about your own faith and spirituality, but if you're willing to go there, I would just love to ask you, what, and Mehnaz, you've already kind of indicated this, but maybe to say a little more about what kind of impact these interfaith experiences and your work with members of other faith traditions and your kind of interfaith coalitions and politics that you've been involved in, what kind of impact that's had on your own faith and spirituality? Because I think the agenda behind this question, and I'll be honest and transparent with all of you guys about the agenda behind the question, is, I think that there is often a kind of mistaken stereotype or assumption that being, too involved with those other religious people will somehow undermine or weaken or dilute one's own faith, one's own tradition. That the way to be the strongest Catholic you can be is to kind of steer clear of those other people. But I think it often works the opposite way, that as Mehnaz has already kind of indicated, that your engagement with other people can in some ways deepen your own faith. So I wonder, I'd love it if you guys could talk a little bit about that path in your own life, and then we'll open this up more broadly to everyone.
I think mine's on, yes. Should I take this one first? Sure. I think from my perspective, Henry, and thank you for asking that question, it did deepen my faith, and I think it was frankly through some of the interfaith work that we did with the local Muslim communities, particularly in Staten Island and in Manhattan, because what we were able to do at those times was before we undertook doing things like I said, the acts of compassion, feeding the hungry, and other acts such as that, we had these planning meetings, and we went to the local mosque. And I have to be honest with you, as I said, I in my personal experience, have friends who are Muslims, but I have to say, I've never been to a mosque before. I mean, this is true. I'm not as young as you guys are. I mean, I'm decades beyond you. So it was really a very fascinating thing growing up here and having never been in a mosque before. And it was, I think, through the example of going to the mosque and looking at the devotion of the people. We were there, thankfully, at the time when the call to prayer, where the azan was said aloud. And at that time, all of our Muslim partners stopped, and they invited us. They said we were welcome to stay, but they immediately went into prayer. And I have to say, the devotion that I witnessed when the prayer was taking place, to me was beautiful. It bespoke my experience of sometimes walking along the street, and sometimes you see people and they could be selling hot dogs or they could be selling pretzels, or they could, maybe be driving the cab. But then sometimes you'll see they pull on the side of the road, they put their prayer rug down, and then facing Mecca, they do their prayer, and they do that 5 times a day. And to me, it brought home some of the devotion that I saw. Began to really make me question the devotion I had to my faith. I mean, it began to say, how devoted am I to my Catholicism? How devoted am I to be able 5 times a day to stop whatever I'm doing? And how devoted are we as Catholics to stop, to remember that God is present with us, to remember that God is part of the conversation? And what kind of world would we have if we all were attentive to our religious faiths in that degree? And we stopped board meetings, or we stopped United Nations meetings, and we were attentive to what God is calling us to. So I certainly think, Henry, it kind of drew me deeper, and I think it's through that devotion that I experienced that deeper reflection might have come.
I already said a little bit about, Judaism, but I want to say something about 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I wasn't living in New York. I moved here from Los Angeles 3 years ago. And I was really, really very angry. And I was angry at my faith. And I was angry at Muslims. And I was angry. And I couldn't believe that Muslims had done this terrible act. And it was through my interfaith work that I was able to come back to saying, okay, this is not what Islam is about. So it's been a very hard time for Muslims all around the world, especially in the United States. But when I saw other Muslims and Christians and Jews and even Buddhists and Hindus and secularists reaching out to Muslims and saying, this is terrible, but we're not going to let this destroy the Muslim community in America. It was a very, very troubling time for me, spiritually, emotionally, physically, because there were lots of incidences of racism towards me. But that was really where I felt the interfaith engagement, cooperation, the way that even my college, Manhattan College, in 2011 hired me courageously, standing by me, saying, we want her, we trust her. And there were a lot of people not very happy about my hire because I was getting a Holocaust in. So it was a big controversy here. But the support that I got post 9/11 from faith communities brought me closer to my own faith and my spirituality.
So I think we have about 15, 20 minutes left, and I would love to just open this up to questions from everyone.
So gentlemen, if you have a question, Dr. Goldschmidt will call on you, and then if you'll step out into the aisle, Ms. Sheena and I will get a microphone too.
Or maybe, sure, sir. And I think, actually, maybe, if I might, Mary, maybe to save time, if there are other people who would like to ask questions, it would be helpful to maybe, line up a little bit in the aisle, and then we'll be ready to move as quickly as possible and make time for as many questions as possible.
So both Islam and Christianity have...
But also do that very quietly while people are talking.
So both Islam and Christianity have this people to your religion. So how do we reconcile this obligation to convert people with pluralism? How do you feel how that works out with Catholic or Catholic faith over Islam?
Not to suck up to the audience, but I'm so impressed with you cut right to the tough questions. That's a big one for you, and he's right. There's a big evangelistic tradition in both Islam and Christianity, and how do you square that with a respect for diversity?
Okay, I'm going to say that I just read you a verse that says, let there be no coercion in religion. We can look at the extreme examples of evangelicalism, but at the same time, I mean, my husband converted to Islam. I know a lot of people are converting to Islam. I co-advise a Muslim group on my campus, and the woman has just converted to Islam out of complete pure will. Pluralism in Islam doesn't mean you convert the person. For example, if you look technically at marriage laws, in the Sharia law, by the way, Sharia law is, it means towards the path. It's not a set law. It has to have consensus. It has to have legal kind of consensus with people. So if you hear the word Sharia, don't be scared. But anyway, the Quran talks very specifically about who one can marry and who one cannot marry, which is interesting. So for a man, you can marry a Jew and a Christian, or a Sabian, which we don't know what that is, without conversion. For a woman, it doesn't say anything. So now women are marrying Christians and Jews and whoever. But the point being is that it's not necessary in Islam to convert a Jew or a Christian, because within the Quran itself, you can freely marry people of other faith.
And just to follow up, I'm going to take this off and speak this probably clearer. I think to follow up on what Mehnaz said, similarly, I think in a sense in Christianity, I think ideally there is a call to evangelization. Certainly there is a call to invite people to become Christian. However, I think that it's exactly that, it's the invitation. And I go back again to Jesus' way of encountering people. And again, I think it really mirrored a little about what Diana Ack was talking about in her writings. I think, in a sense, Jesus as the person of God in flesh and blood was calling people, was inviting people, and I think that's what we're called to do. I think Pope Francis is telling us this too. I think by concentrating on the good works of the church, he's calling people, I think, to let them speak and to let them invite people to become evangelized, to become Christian. There's an old song called "They Will Know They Are a Christian by Their Love." And I think that's probably the path to evangelization that I think Christians are called to, and I think they're most successful when that path is followed.
Also, let me add one other kind of twist to this from my sort of scholar of religion perspective. You know, it's important to recognize that every religious tradition across the board, every religious and cultural tradition is in some ways, you know, inconsistent and internally contradictory, right? There's a diversity of belief and a diversity of perspective and a diversity of emphasis within every tradition. So for sure, you're going to find some Christians and some Muslims for whom, and some Buddhists and some other people, for whom, you know, their overriding goal is to convert the world and make everyone else like them. No question. There are people like that. You're also going to find some Christians and some Muslims and Buddhists and everyone else for whom their overriding goal is to build these kinds of relationships of respect and understanding across difference that we've been talking about. And I would caution you against, you know, pointing to either one of those aspects of a tradition and saying, aha, you know, that's the real deal, that's the essence, right? So Tom and Mehnaz like may sound great, but look, there's these other Christians and Muslims trying to convert the world, and therefore that, you know, disproves what Tom and Mehnaz are saying, because every tradition is internally complex and internally diverse and sometimes internally contradictory. So again, I think it was a great question about this tension between, you know, interfaith work and evangelism, but the fact that there's that tension doesn't like disprove or you know, poo-poo either side of the tension. Any other questions? The floor is yours, guys.
Can I just say something? There's a question.
Well, he's going to work his way towards the center aisle.
I want to say something. I teach a class called Religion and Genocide, and a lot of my students come away saying, oh my God, religion is horrible, it's intolerant, you know, if you look at centuries-old genocides and even today, unfortunately, ongoing genocides, you know, religion does play a role. But I want you to think about this for a second. Religion is not something that knocks on your door. It's something that we have created as a body of interpretation. So it's not as if it's just sitting there statically saying, this is what you have to do. We go to it. We create and interpret what we need from it. So in a sense, I'm giving you the freedom to decide how you want to see this vast body of sacred literature and how you want to use that in the world pluralistically. And faced with the extremism that I have in the Muslim world, so say there's 1.5 billion Muslims and a small percentage are extremists, that still gives me 10 million people. That's a lot of people, right? So how do I negotiate that in terms of being Muslim? And that's a question you all should be asking as Christians, Catholics, for yourselves.
How do you think we should try to encourage this development between religious groups in certain sects of any of these larger religions that are more prone to shutting out these other religions?
How to foster the more pluralistic side of any tradition.
If I could just take a stab at that, the reason that when Catholic Charities decided to partner with the Interfaith Center in working with the Islamic communities within New York, and again, we should say there were very diverse Islamic communities we worked with. We worked with African American mosques, we worked with Albanian mosques, we worked with mosques primarily for West African peoples. The reason that we focused as we did on social services, the reason that we wound up focusing on feeding the hungry, and the reason that we wind up focusing on doing clothing drives, and the reason that we focused on cleaning up. We did one work with youth where the youth would go and they would first wind up going to visit the local Catholic church and help clean up that, and then they would go visit the local mosque and clean up that. We focused on those tasks because by focusing on those tasks, the Mehnaz had indicated are both, as you heard in the Quran, and we are told to do in the Bible. By focusing on those and working side by side, relationships can develop. And I think from those relationships, from being able to work together towards common goals that both our faiths call us to, eventually after that, then dialogue can develop and dialogue can emerge. Rather than starting off with a dialogue where two people are sitting across the table and saying, let's talk about religion. Now you guys probably have always heard it. What are the two things you're never supposed to talk about in polite company? Politics and religion, right? So probably most people think that's off the table.
Those are like my two favorite things.
Those are my two favorite things too. That's my whole job. But I was going to say, if you can concentrate on doing that good work and do it side by side and have the conversation grow out of that good work that you're both called to do by your faith, I think that could be maybe a method that you could use to wind up approaching some of these dialogues.
Right, start from interfaith practice and show the world what good can come out of these relationships, and then the sort of dialogue and intellectual part can follow from that.
Exactly.
Mehnaz, do you want to take
Yeah, I mean, I'm just I'll echo Tom's point, but I just want to add to one thing. I think the question is really good. I mean, I'm very frustrated with this question because every time I go to a synagogue and talk, they say, well, where are people like you? We never hear about, pluralistic side of Islam. It's a big problem because we have a big, big problem in media. What are you guys seeing about Muslims? It's terrible, right? I mean, I'm going home to Pakistan for 2 weeks where my whole family lives. And people say, are you petrified? Yeah, I'm a little scared about security and ransom and things like that, but I'm not scared that I'm going to be blown up. Right? So, I mean, these are questions this media, how are people portrayed in the media in terms of religion? Right? What is the media doing? Why am I not on CNN? I'm not on CNN or Fox because I'm not sensational enough. I'm just, I'm a really relatively normal girl, right? So, those kinds of questions should be coming into your mind. And the other is, how do you understand pluralism? Is to say, there must be another side to this. Do I really want to see this negativity? Do I really want to be this pessimistic? Right? I mean, these are questions that can help you move forward. And I tell my students to change their homepage every time they take a class with me. Every 2 weeks, different news media, whether it's from Egypt, whether it's from Pakistan, whether it's from Israel, whether it's from different countries. You know, explore, use what you have as your tool, right? We never had the internet like you have today, but use it wisely. It's a beautiful tool to have. And this is where you'll say, wow, God, there's so much pluralism in the world. I can't believe the great projects that are going on, right? So that's part of the way of looking at where is the pluralistic voice.
Yeah, I think Mehnaz's point about the media is so important, and it leads to the very optimistic, encouraging idea that, you know, maybe the pluralistic strains within all of the world's religious traditions are actually a lot stronger and more vibrant than you would think. If you just follow it in the media, all you hear about is religious extremism and religious conflict and the not so pluralistic side of the equation. But you know, out there, every day, on the ground, pluralism is thriving more than we might imagine from, you know, the evening news. We have time for at least one more question, if anyone else wants to step up, literally and figuratively.
Hi. A lot of what you talk about stresses how our shared faith and our shared devotion can move us towards like more interfaith dialogue and more reconciliation between faiths. But how do you think increasingly secular and an increasingly non-religious society, like, I mean, one, how do you think that affects interfaith dialogue? Like, do you think it, you know, creates more tolerance? Or how do you think just secularism, especially like in the U.S., I mean, religion is not a big aspect of everyone's life here. How do you think that affects what you guys do?
Sure, thank you for that. I think from the perspective of secular society, I think you're right, it does impact certainly a lot of the work that we do. I think for Catholic Charities, for example, you know, one of the things that we do is it's very clear that we don't serve people because they are Catholic. We serve all people because we believe that they're made in the image and likeness of God, and we serve them because we are Catholic. And I think that understanding is such. I think that it's interesting, but and I'm glad that Mehnaz was able to read passages from the Quran, because I think whether people are secular, or whether they're religious, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim, I think everyone understands the language of compassion. I think the language of compassion is something that really communicates across cultures. And if any of you have had the opportunity to travel overseas, you'll be able to see this. I think so long as, it's very funny, but I mean, a smile is universal. You know, an extended hand of help is universal. I think that the language of compassion, doing those things that both of our religious traditions are called to do, are the same things that, for example, the Humanist Manifesto calls us to do. So I think, again, to concentrate, I think, on the service aspect, to concentrate on those things that draw us together is very important. I'm glad that Mehnaz mentioned the media, because, again, that's not going to make Fox News. That's not going to make, MSNBC. That's not going to make the headlines because it's not sensational. But it's something that every day, Islamic Charities, Catholic Charities, Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, UJA, all of the agencies, and other very good secular agencies are doing to help people, to help the homeless on our streets, to help people who are leaving prison, to help women who are trying to struggle to raise their families by themselves. I think these are the places and the means and the language that we should be using to communicate to them.
I think being in a secular country is wonderful. If you look at the history of the founding fathers of the United States and how they, even in 1600s, were writing diverse texts for colleges. They were all male colleges at that time, but they were, and they were including religious freedom. There's a student of mine who's doing a project with me about religious freedom and secularism, and if you look at the laws in France, that you cannot wear any religious symbol if you work for the public sector, that becomes very problematic, right? So, I mean, we have a lot of freedom here, and I think being in a secular state allows the kind of diversity we have here. We can wear anything we want, right? We can practice anything we want. So, in a way, the United States allows for deep-rooted, faith-oriented people people to coexist with the secular state. Right? I mean, if you look at the Constitution, I'm trying to remember the language, I just did this with my kids, but it talks about that very blatantly. And I think that's something that we are very honored to have, and very blessed to have in this country. And it doesn't mean that secular people or atheist people have no morality, right? They just choose differently, and they should be as accepted as everybody else.
Actually, also just add, we were basically out of time, but just very briefly, I don't want to get all autobiographical for myself, but I come to this conversation in many ways as a secularist. I mean, I'm Jewish, my family is Jewish, I'm very invested in Jewish traditions in my own extremely secular way, but I've never been accused of being devout. But I've been deeply engaged with these questions about religious diversity for my whole adult and professional life, because it challenges and moves and inspires me as a secular person to be in conversation with people of faith who kind of think and experience the world so differently than I do. So for those of you out there, I mean, I know everyone here is baptized Catholic, but I'm sure some of you are quite devout, some of you not so much. Some of you, I'm sure, are saying, oh, my parents are Catholic, I'm an atheist. Even for the atheists in the room, a really deep engagement with religion and religious diversity and all the kind of interfaith issues we've been talking about today can really be transformative and really enrich your lives in ways that are very profound, even if they're not all that spiritual or faithy. I mean, that's been my experience of it. And I think we're really out of time, so I just want to